The portal tore open above the green world of Thalvara like a wound in space itself, and the light that poured through was neither blue nor white, but something in between, that hurt to look at directly. Lyria felt it before she saw it because her connection to Silverwind and Nightflame ran deeper than sight or sound, and both dragons lifted their heads from where they rested in the mountain cave, and their eyes glowed with ancient warning. She had been studying the old texts again, trying to understand the symbols her grandmother had left behind, and the pages spoke of a time when the sky would crack, and strangers would come from beyond the known stars. The Krenth Empire had ruled this sector for so long that most elves had forgotten what freedom tasted like, and their warships hung in orbit like dark moons blocking out the stars and demanding tribute. Every season, Lyria was 20 cycles old when the Krenth first came to Thalvara, and she remembered her father standing tall before their soldiers and refusing to bow, and she remembered the fire that consumed their home afterward. That was when she ran to the mountains and found the cave where her grandmother had hidden 2 dragon eggs before the old ways were forbidden, and she raised them in secret, teaching herself from the ancient texts. Silverwind was the color of moonlight on water, and could fly faster than any creature Lyria had ever seen, and Nightflame was dark as the void between stars with fire in his belly that could melt stone. The portal grew wider, and through it came ships that looked nothing like Krenth vessels because these were built for war, not intimidation, and their hulls bore scars from countless battles. Captain Miranda Stone stood on the bridge of the Resolute watching the portal close behind her fleet, and she felt the weight of responsibility for the 3,000 souls who had followed her through the gateway. Beside her feet lay Ember and Ash, her 2 massive warhounds, who had been bred on Earth for protection and loyalty, and they sensed her tension and pressed against her legs. The journey had taken 2 years of preparation, and the decision to leave everything behind had not been easy, but Earth had become crowded and polluted, and humanity needed a new start. They had found the portal technology in ruins on Mars buried beneath red sand for millions of years, and the scientists said it was a doorway to other parts of the galaxy. Miranda had volunteered to lead the first colony fleet because she believed in giving humanity a second chance, and because she had nothing left on Earth after the wars took everyone she loved. Her crew was made up of volunteers who wanted the same thing, and they had trained together for 18 months, learning to work as one unit. The sensor officer called out contacts in orbit, and the display showed 200 Krenth warships surrounding the planet below. Miranda studied the tactical readout and saw the ships were positioned, not for defense but for oppression, and their weapons were aimed at the surface. She had seen this before on other worlds during her service in the Earth Defense Force, and she knew what it meant when a powerful empire held a weaker people hostage. The communications officer received a transmission from the Krenth fleet, and the message was simple and brutal: "Surrender your ships or be destroyed." Miranda looked at her second-in-command, who was a woman named Katie Liu, and Katie met her eyes with the same determination. They had come too far to turn back, and they had left Earth specifically to escape empires that demanded submission. Miranda opened a channel to her fleet, and her voice was calm but firm when she told them to prepare for combat on the surface. Lyria felt the shift in the energy above her world, and she climbed onto Silverwind's back, while Nightflame spread his wings beside them. The Elven Council had forbidden dragonflight decades ago, when the Krenth made it clear that any resistance would be met with total destruction. But Lyria had never been good at following rules, and she needed to see what was happening in the sky. They rose through the clouds and broke into the upper atmosphere where the air was thin and cold, and from there she could see the human fleet holding position between Thalvara and the Krenth ships. The Krenth commander sent another message demanding immediate surrender and threatening to destroy the human fleet and then burn the planet below. As punishment for harboring potential allies, Miranda did not respond with words because she knew that bullies only understood one language. She gave the order to her weapons officer, and the Resolute fired its main railgun at the closest Krenth destroyer. The projectile crossed the distance in 3 seconds and punched through the Krenth shields like they were paper, and the destroyer split in half, spilling atmosphere and crew into the void. For a moment everything was still and silent, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Then the Krenth fleet opened fire with every weapon they had, and the human ships moved into defensive formation and returned fire with precision that spoke of years of training. Lyria watched from above as the battle unfolded, and she saw immediately that these humans fought differently than anyone she had ever known. The Krenth relied on overwhelming firepower and superior numbers, but the humans moved like wolves, hunting as a pack and covering each other and striking at weak points with devastating accuracy. Krenth cruiser broke formation trying to flank the human line, and Miranda saw the opportunity and sent 3 of her destroyers to intercept. The cruiser never reached its target because the human ships tore it apart with coordinated fire that hit the reactor core and caused a chain reaction. Within 15 minutes, 12 Krenth ships were destroyed, and the human fleet had not lost a single vessel, though several ships showed damage to their shields. The Krenth commander realized too late that he had underestimated these strangers, and he called for retreat, but Miranda would not let them regroup. Her fleet pursued the fleeing Krenth ships and destroyed 6 more before they escaped into faster-than-light travel. When the battle ended, Lyria remained hovering above the planet on Silverwind with Nightflame beside her, and she stared at the human ships in wonder. These warriors had done in minutes what her people had dreamed of for decades, and they had made the Krenth flee in fear. She made a decision then that would change everything, and she urged Silverwind forward toward the largest human ship, while Nightflame followed close behind. Miranda received reports of 2 large contacts approaching from the planet, and when they appeared on visual display, she could not believe what she was seeing. Dragons were supposed to be extinct or mythical, and yet here they were flying through space toward her ship. She ordered her crew to hold fire, and she went to the airlock to meet whatever came next. Because if there were dragons in this galaxy, then maybe humanity had found something worth fighting for after all. Lyria guided Silverwind toward the hull of the massive human warship, and her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and excitement, because she was about to meet beings who had just shattered 3 centuries of Krenth dominance. The ship was called Resolute according to the symbols on its side, and it was larger than anything the elves had ever built, with weapons that could destroy worlds. Nightflame flew beside them, radiating protective energy, and small flames escaped from his nostrils whenever he sensed potential danger. As they approached, a section of the hull opened, revealing an airlock large enough for both dragons to enter, and Lyria felt a moment of doubt, because entering that ship meant trusting complete strangers. But these strangers had fought the Krenth without hesitation, and that was worth taking a risk. She urged Silverwind forward, and they glided into the airlock with Nightflame following, and as soon as they were inside, the outer door closed and air flooded the chamber. Lyria could feel the pressure equalizing, and then the inner door opened, revealing a large bay that seemed designed for shuttles or cargo. Standing in the center of the bay was a human woman wearing dark armor that bore the marks of recent combat, and beside her stood 2 enormous hounds with gray fur and intelligent eyes. The woman removed her helmet, revealing short dark hair and brown eyes that showed no fear despite facing 2 dragons, and she smiled as she stepped forward. Miranda had faced many dangers in her life, from combat against hostile aliens to surviving disasters on Earth. But meeting a dragon rider felt different somehow, more significant. She walked slowly toward the elf woman, keeping her hands visible and away from her weapons. Because first impressions mattered when making new allies, Lyria slid down from Silverwind's back and stood before the human captain, and she was surprised to see they were nearly the same height, because she had expected humans to be much larger. The woman extended her hand in what Lyria recognized as a greeting gesture from the ancient texts, and she took it, feeling the strength in the human's grip. Miranda spoke first, saying her name, and explaining that her people had come through a portal from a distant world called Earth, seeking a new home and new friends. Lyria listened carefully because she had learned several languages from the old texts, and this human spoke a variation of the common trade tongue. She introduced herself and explained about Thalvara and the elven people, and how the Krenth had oppressed them for generations. Miranda's expression darkened when she heard about the Krenth occupation, and she said her people had left Earth specifically to escape empires that treated others as property. The 2 women talked for over an hour while Silverwind and Nightflame investigated Ember and Ash, and the 4 animals seemed to reach an understanding of their own. Lyria explained that dragons had once been common on Thalvara, but the Krenth had hunted them to near extinction and forced the elves to abandon the old ways. She told Miranda about finding the eggs and raising the dragons in secret and learning to fly and fight as her ancestors had done. Miranda listened with growing respect because this young elf had risked everything to preserve her culture, and that took the kind of courage she valued. She explained that humans came from what they called a death world, where gravity was higher and predators were everywhere, and the environment constantly tried to kill them. This was why humans were so good at fighting, because survival on Earth meant learning to face danger. Head on, Lyria asked why they had intervened in the battle, and Miranda said simply that her people believed in protecting those who could not protect themselves. It was a matter of honor and principle, and humans had made too many mistakes in their past to repeat them in their future. Suddenly alarms blared throughout the ship, and Katie Lou's voice came over the communication system reporting that a massive Krenth fleet had just arrived in the system. Miranda's face became hard and focused, and she told Lyria to stay in the bay where it was safe while she returned to the bridge, but Lyria refused, saying that this was her world and her people, and she would not hide while others fought for their freedom. The dragons seemed to agree, because both Silverwind and Nightflame moved to flank Lyria, and their eyes glowed with determination. Miranda studied the elf woman and the dragons and made a quick decision, because sometimes the best allies were the ones who refused to back down. She said that if Lyria was going to fight, then they would fight together, and she asked if dragons could survive. In the vacuum of space, Lyria smiled and said that ancient dragons were born in the void between worlds and could fly anywhere they wished. They returned to the bridge together with the dragons following, and when the crew saw them, there was a moment of shocked silence. Then Katie started laughing and said that if they were going to face impossible odds, they might as well have dragons on their side. The tactical display showed over 500 Krenth warships entering the system, and their formation was designed for overwhelming assault. Miranda knew her 50 ships could not win a straight fight against those numbers, but she also knew that battles were not won by having the most ships, but by having the best strategy. She opened a channel to the Krenth commander, and her message was simple: withdraw or face destruction. The Krenth commander responded with mockery, saying that humans were fools to threaten an empire that had ruled for 1,000 years. Miranda smiled and said that every empire fell eventually, and some just needed a push. She cut the transmission and turned to Lyria, asking if she had any other surprises like hidden weapons or ancient technology. Lyria thought for a moment and then remembered something from her grandmother's texts about the old defense network that the elves had built long ago. It was supposed to be automated and still active, buried deep beneath the mountains, but no one had accessed it in 300 years. Miranda told her sensor officer to scan for any artificial structures underground, and within minutes they found what Lyria had described. There were weapons platforms hidden across the planet, designed to defend against orbital assault, and they were still powered and waiting for activation. Katie asked how they could activate a system that had been dormant for centuries, and Lyria said the dragons could do it, because they were connected to the old magic that powered everything. Miranda did not fully understand the concept of magic, but she understood results, and if dragons could wake up planetary defenses, then she would work with what she had. She developed a plan that was either brilliant or insane, depending on who you asked, and she explained it to her command crew. The human fleet would engage the Krenth, directly drawing their attention and firepower, while Lyria and the dragons flew to the surface and activated the defense network. Once the platforms were online, they would have the Krenth fleet caught between two fires, and the numerical advantage would mean nothing. Katie pointed out that the plan required perfect timing and incredible luck, and that many human ships would be destroyed before the defense network came online. Miranda agreed, but said that sometimes you had to risk everything to gain everything, and this was one of those times. Lyria said her people would never forget what the humans were about to do, and that the elves would stand with humanity for as long as both peoples existed. Miranda clasped her hand and said that was all she could ask for, and then she gave the order to prepare for battle. The human fleet moved into attack formation, and Lyria mounted Silverwind, while Nightflame spread his wings ready to dive back toward the planetays. The Krenth fleet approached Miranda, looked at the elf woman one last time, and said they would meet again when the battle was won. Lyria nodded and urged her dragons through the airlock and back into space, racing toward Thalvara, while behind her, the human ships charged forward to face overwhelming odds with courage that would become legend. The Krenth fleet opened fire with everything they had, and space itself seemed to burn with the fury of 500 warships unleashing their weapons at once. Miranda watched the tactical display as energy beams and missiles streaked toward her fleet, and she gave orders with calm precision, directing her ships to scatter and reform in patterns that the Krenth could not predict. The first human ship to take damage was the destroyer called Defiant, and its shields collapsed under sustained fire from 3 Krenth cruisers. But before the killing blow could land, 2 other human ships moved to protect it. This was how humanity fought, never leaving anyone behind and always covering their weakest members, because that was what separated them from empires like the Krenth. Katie coordinated the defense from her station, calling out threats and directing counterfire, and her voice never wavered, even as explosions rocked the Resolute below. On Thalvara, Lyria pushed Silverwind to fly, faster than he had ever flown before, and Nightflame struggled to keep pace as they raced toward the ancient mountain, where the defense network controls were hidden. The Elven Council had sent her desperate messages demanding to know what was happening, but she ignored them because there was no time for explanations or debates. She could feel the battle raging above through her connection with the dragons, and she knew people were dying up there, fighting for a world they had just discovered. Silverwind landed hard on the mountain peak, and Lyria jumped down, running toward the stone archway that marked the entrance to the old shrine. The symbols carved into the rock glowed faintly as she approached, and she pressed her hand against them, speaking the activation words her grandmother had taught her. Nothing happened at first, and panic rose in her chest, because if this did not work, then the human fleet would be destroyed, and the Krenth would punish Thalvara for the alliance. Then Nightflame stepped forward and breathed a stream of fire onto the archway, and the ancient magic responded to the dragon flame awakening after centuries of sleep. The ground shook, and across the planet hidden platforms began to rise from beneath mountains, and forests and oceans. In space, Miranda saw the platforms appear on her sensors, and she allowed herself a brief moment of hope before a Krenth battleship fired its main cannon at the Resolute. The blast struck their forward shields, and the ship lurched sideways, and warning lights flashed across every console. The weapons officer reported shield strength down to 40%, and Katie called for emergency power to be diverted from non-essential systems. Miranda knew they just needed to hold on a few more minutes until the defense platforms came online. But minutes felt like hours when facing this kind of firepower. A human frigate called Morning Star took a direct hit to its reactor core and exploded in a ball of fire. And Miranda felt the loss of 200 crew members like a knife to her heart. But she could not afford to grieve now, because 30 more ships and 3,000 more people depended on her keeping a clear head. She ordered her fleet to focus fire on the Krenth command ship, because if they could take out the enemy leadership, the rest might falter. 20 human vessels concentrated their weapons on the massive Krenth dreadnought, and the combined assault overwhelmed its shields and cracked its armor. The Krenth commander screamed orders at his fleet, demanding they protect him, and ships broke formation to shield the damaged dreadnought. This was the mistake Miranda had been waiting for, because a fleet out of formation was vulnerable, and she exploited the opening mercilessly. On Thalvara, the defense platforms fully activated and their targeting systems locked onto the Krenth ships, and Lyria spoke the final command word that released them to fire beams of pure energy lanced up from the planet, surface striking Krenth ships with devastating precision. And the platforms had been built by the ancient elves, who understood warfare better than their descendants. The Krenth fleet found itself caught between the human ships pressing from above and the planetary defenses striking from below, and their formation collapsed into chaos. Ships collided, trying to evade attacks from multiple directions, and some Krenth captains abandoned their positions, fleeing toward the edge of the system. Miranda saw the tide turning, and she pressed the advantage, ordering her fleet to drive hard into the enemy center. The Resolute led the charge with its railguns firing continuously, and Ember and Ash howled from somewhere in the ship as if they could sense victory approaching. Katie reported that 15 more Krenth ships had been destroyed, and twice that many were retreating with heavy damage. The Krenth commander made one final attempt to salvage the battle by ordering all remaining ships to target the planet surface directly. If he could not win, then he would at least punish the elves for their defiance, and his ships turned their weapons downward. But Lyria had anticipated this, because cruelty was predictable, and she had programmed the defense. platforms to prioritize any ship that targeted civilian areas. The platforms fired with increased intensity, and every Krenth ship that tried to attack the surface was torn apart before it could launch its weapons. The Krenth commander realized then that he had lost not just the battle, but any chance of maintaining control over this sector. He gave the order to retreat, and what remained of his fleet jumped to faster-than-light travel, leaving behind debris and escape pods. Miranda ordered her ships to cease fire and to begin rescue operations for any survivors, both human and Krenth, because honor demanded treating prisoners with dignity. The human fleet had lost 4 ships and taken heavy damage to a dozen more, but they had won against odds that should have been impossible. Lyria flew back to the Resolute on Silverwind, and when she entered the bridge, the entire crew stood and saluted her because she had saved them all. Miranda embraced her and said that from this moment forward, humans and elves were allies bound by blood and battle. Katie pulled up a communication from the planet's surface, and the Elven Council was requesting immediate contact with both the human commander and Lyria. The council elder appeared on the screen, and his face showed a mixture of shock and grudging respect, and he said that Lyria had violated every law and custom by activating the forbidden weapons. Lyria stood straight and met his gaze without flinching, and she said that some laws needed to be broken when survival was at stake. The elder was silent for a moment, and then he smiled and said that perhaps the young generation understood some things better than the old. He formally invited the humans to land on Thalvara and begin negotiations. For a permanent alliance, Miranda accepted and said her people would be honored to call this world their new home. Over the next hours, human ships began landing in designated areas far from elven cities, and the colonists emerged carrying seeds and tools, and Hope Lyria walked among them with Silverwind and Nightflame, and she saw families and children and people who just wanted a chance to build something better. She found Miranda overseeing the establishment of the first settlement, and Ember and Ash were playing with human children who showed no fear of the massive hounds. Miranda said that this was what they had been searching for, a place where they could live in peace and raise the next generation without the mistakes of the past. Lyria replied that her people had also been searching without knowing it for allies who valued freedom as much as they did. The 2 women stood together watching the sunset over Thalvara, and above them dragons flew in formation with human shuttles, and both knew that something new had begun. The Krenth would return eventually because empires never gave up easily, but when they came, they would face not a divided sector but a united front, and perhaps other worlds would hear the story of how humans and elves stood together, and they too would find the courage to resist. That night, the Elven Council hosted a feast for the human commanders, and Lyria sat beside Miranda, and they talked late into the evening about their peoples and their hopes. Katie asked about dragon eggs and whether humans might someday learn to ride them, and Lyria laughed and said that dragons chose their riders, not the other way around. But she promised to introduce interested humans to Silverwind and Nightflame and see if the ancient magic could bridge the gap between species. As the celebration continued, Miranda looked around at her crew mingling with elves, and she felt something she had not felt in years, and that was genuine optimism about the future. They had come through a portal hoping to find a new beginning, and instead they had found something better, which was a cause worth fighting for and friends worth dying beside. And across the galaxy, the Krenth Empire received reports of their defeat, and the generals and admirals knew that everything had changed because humanity had arrived and they fought with honor. The weeks following the battle brought changes to Thalvara that no one could have imagined, and human engineers worked alongside elven craftsmen to build settlements that blended technology with nature. Miranda established her command center in what the elves called the Valley of First Light, and from there she coordinated the integration of 2 very different peoples into one community. Lyria spent her days flying between the human settlements and elven cities, acting as translator and mediator and helping both sides understand each other. The cultural differences were significant because humans valued efficiency and progress, while elves valued tradition and harmony. But both peoples shared core values of loyalty and courage. Katie had taken charge of training programs where humans taught combat tactics and elves taught survival skills, and the mixed groups formed bonds that transcended species. Silverwind and Nightflame became celebrities among human children who had never seen creatures of such power and grace, and the dragons seemed to enjoy the attention. Ember and Ash adopted several human families, and could often be found sleeping in front of different homes each night, as if they wanted to know everyone. The Elven Council met with Miranda regularly to discuss defense strategies and trade agreements and resource allocation, and slowly trust grew between them. But not everyone was happy with the changes, because some elves believed humans would eventually dominate them, and some humans worried about losing their identity. One morning, Lyria received word that a group of traditional elves had refused to allow human engineers near their forest settlements and were threatening violence if approached. She flew immediately to the area with both dragons and found about 30 elves blocking a road where human trucks were trying to deliver medical supplies. The leader of the group was an elder named Theron, who had fought against the Krenth in his youth and lost his family in the reprisals. He told Lyria that humans were no different than the Krenth and would eventually show their true nature as conquerors. Lyria dismounted from Silverwind and walked to stand before Theron, and she spoke with respect, because she understood his fear. She reminded him that she too had lost family to the Krenth, and that she had every reason to be suspicious of powerful strangers, but she had seen humans sacrifice their own lives to protect elves they had never met, and that was not the action of conquerors. Theron was unmoved and said that predators often wore friendly faces at first, and that giving humans a foothold on Thalvara would lead to enslavement. Miranda arrived then with only Katie and Ember, and she had come, unarmed, to show she meant no threat. She asked Theron what would convince him of human intentions, and he said nothing, because actions could be faked and words were meaningless. Miranda thought for a moment and then made an offer that shocked everyone present, including her own second-in-command. She said that if Theron did not trust humans, then he should come live with them for 1 month and watch everything they did, and if at the end he still believed they were a threat, then humans would relocate away from elven territories. Theron was suspicious of this offer because it seemed too generous, and he asked what humans gained from this arrangement. Miranda replied that they gained nothing except perhaps trust, and that was worth more than land or resources. Katie pulled Miranda aside and quietly reminded her that this could be a security risk, and that not all humans would agree to being observed. But Miranda said that if they had nothing to hide, then they had nothing to fear, and transparency was the only way to build real alliances. Theron agreed to the arrangement, though he made it clear he expected to find evidence of human deception. He moved into the human settlement that day and was given a small dwelling near the command center, where he could observe operations. For the first week, he watched with hostile suspicion, taking notes and asking pointed questions about military capabilities and resource extraction. He saw humans working long hours to build homes and farms and infrastructure, and he noted that they seemed to share resources equally. He observed human children attending schools with elven children, and learning both languages and both cultures. He watched as human doctors treated elven patients with the same care they gave their own people and refused payment for their services. He saw Miranda spending hours in meetings with the Elven Council and deferring to their knowledge about local conditions and environmental concerns. What surprised Theron most was that humans argued with each other constantly about the best way to do things, and that no single voice dominated decisions on Earth. Disagreement had been crushed by the authorities, but here it seemed to be expected and encouraged. In the second week, Theron began asking different questions, more about human history and less about human intentions. Katie sat with him one evening and told him about the wars that had nearly destroyed Earth and how humanity had learned from those mistakes. She explained that humans came to Thalvara not to escape their problems, but to avoid repeating them elsewhere. She showed him recordings from Earth of the environmental damage and social inequality that had plagued their home world. Theron saw cities choked with pollution and people starving while others lived in luxury, and he understood why humans wanted something different. He asked why humans had not simply conquered a less defended world and taken what they needed by force. Katie said that some humans had wanted exactly that, but the majority had chosen a harder path, which was to earn their place through cooperation. In the third week, Theron stopped taking notes and started participating in daily life, and he helped human engineers understand which plants were safe to move and which were sacred. He taught human farmers about the seasonal patterns of Thalvara and which crops would grow best in different regions. He even began teaching human children some elven songs and was surprised to Find he enjoyed their enthusiasm and curiosity. Lyria visited him often and could see the change in his demeanor, and she knew that understanding was replacing fear. On the final day of the month, Theron requested a meeting with both Miranda and the Elven Council to deliver his conclusions. Everyone gathered in the council chamber, and the tension was thick because this decision would shape the future of both peoples. Theron stood before them, and his voice was strong but not angry when he spoke. He said that he had come expecting to find evidence of human treachery, and instead he had found people who were flawed but genuine. He had seen humans make mistakes and admit them and work to fix them, which was something the Krenth had never done. Had watched humans struggle with their own fears and prejudices but choose cooperation over conflict. Most importantly, he had seen that humans valued freedom for themselves and others equally, and that was the mark of true allies. He announced that he would recommend the Elven Council formalize the alliance and grant humans permanent settlement rights on Thalvara. The council members looked at each other, and then the eldest stood and said that Theron's word carried great weight, and his recommendation would be honored. Miranda stood and thanked Theron for his honesty and his willingness to challenge his own assumptions. She said that humans would strive every day to be worthy of the trust being placed in them. That evening, there was a celebration, and both humans and elves gathered to mark the formal alliance. Lyria stood with Miranda, watching the two peoples dance and share food and tell stories. Miranda said that this was harder than fighting the Krenth, because battles were simple. But building trust required patience and vulnerability. Lyria agreed and added that trust once earned was stronger than any shield or weapon. Silver wind and night flame flew overhead, breathing gentle fire that lit the night sky, and human children cheered while elven elders smiled. Katie approached with news that scouts had detected Krenth probe ships at the edge of the system, and everyone knew what that meant. The Krenth were observing and planning their return, and the alliance would soon face its greatest test. But looking around at humans and elves working together, Miranda felt confident that whatever came, they would face it united. Theron approached and said that his people in the forests were ready to join the defense network and contribute to the shared protection. Miranda clasped his arm in the human way and said that every ally made them stronger. As the celebration continued into the night, both peoples knew that challenges lay ahead, but they also knew they no longer faced those challenges alone. The alliance between humans and elves had been forged in battle and tempered in trust, and now it would be tested by time and adversity. But that was a concern for tomorrow, and tonight was for celebrating what they had built together against all odds. 3 months after the alliance was formalized, the Krenth returned with a fleet that made their previous attempt look small, and over 2,000 warships emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. Miranda received the alert while meeting with the Elven Council about agricultural expansion, and everyone in the room understood immediately what this meant. The Krenth had committed resources that could have conquered entire sectors, and they were coming for vengeance, not just territory. Lyria felt Silverwind and Nightflame react to her surge of fear, and she forced herself to breathe slowly, because panic would help no one. Katie was already coordinating with the defense network, and human ships were launching from the surface and moving into position. The Elven Council elder looked at Miranda and asked if the humans would stand with them even against such overwhelming force. Miranda did not hesitate before answering, and she said that humans kept their promises, especially to friends, and that retreat was not in their nature. She left immediately for the Resolute, and Lyria followed with her dragons because they had fought together before and would do so again. The human fleet had grown slightly with reinforcements that had come through the portal from Earth, but they still only had 70 ships against 2,000. The Krenth commander sent a message, and his voice dripped with contempt as he demanded the immediate surrender of both human and elven forces. He promised that if they complied, he would only execute the leadership and spare the civilians. If they resisted, he would sterilize the entire planet and leave nothing alive. Miranda recorded her response and made sure every Krenth ship received it. Told the commander that humanity had faced extinction before and survived, and that they would not bow to threats no matter how large the fleet. She said that humans had a saying about underestimating the weak, and that the Krenth were about to learn that lesson the hard way. The Krenth fleet began its advance in perfect formation, confident that sheer numbers would overwhelm any defense. But Miranda had spent 3 months preparing for this moment, and she had used that time wisely. The defense platforms on Thalvara had been upgraded with human technology, and now there were twice as many as before. Human engineers had also built weapon satellites in orbit that looked like communications equipment, but were actually missile platforms. Most importantly, the combined human and elven forces had trained together, learning to coordinate their very different fighting styles. As the Krenth fleet entered weapons range, the defense platforms opened fire, but instead of targeting the largest ships, they focused on the command and control vessels. Chaos spread through the Krenth formation as admiral ships exploded and the chain of command fractured. The missile satellites activated and launched thousands of projectiles that swarmed toward the Krenth fleet like angry insects. Individual missiles did little damage, but in such numbers they overwhelmed point defense systems and began taking out shields. The human fleet split into small groups of 5 ships each, and they attacked from multiple directions, forcing the Krenth to divide their attention. Katie had programmed attack patterns based on wolfpack tactics, and each group targeted a specific section of the Krenth formation Lyria, and her dragons flew with a squadron of human fighters, and they struck at Krenth ships that tried to break through the defensive line. Silverwind breathed fire that melted armor, while Nightflame used his claws to tear through shield generators. The human pilots had learned to work with the dragons, using them as living shields and strike craft that could maneuver in ways no machine could match. Despite all these advantages, the Krenth fleet was simply too large, and human ships began taking critical damage. The destroyer Valiant lost all power and drifted helplessly until a Krenth cruiser targeted it for destruction. Miranda saw this on her display and made a decision that would either save her people or doom them. She ordered the Resolute to break formation and charged directly at the center of the Krenth fleet alone. Katie protested, saying this was suicide, but Miranda said that sometimes you had to do something crazy to win an impossible fight. The Resolute accelerated to maximum speed and its railguns fired continuously as it plowed through the Krenth formation. Enemy ships tried to intercept, but Miranda had her pilot weaving and dodging in patterns that made them difficult to target. The Krenth commander could not believe what he was seeing, and he ordered all ships to focus fire on this insane human vessel. This was exactly what Miranda wanted, because every ship shooting at the Resolute was not shooting at anything else. The human fleet and defense platforms took advantage of the distraction and destroyed 50 Krenth ships in 3 minutes, but the Resolute was taking devastating damage, and systems were failing across the ship. The shields collapsed and hull breaches vented atmosphere, and crew members died at their stations. Miranda refused to turn back because she had committed to this course, and backing down now would waste their sacrifice. Then something unexpected happened, and 3 elven ships that had been hidden in the asteroid belt suddenly appeared behind the Krenth fleet. These were ancient vessels that had not flown in centuries, but the elves had secretly repaired them using human technology. They were small and lightly armed, but they carried weapons the Krenth had never seen before. The elven ships fired beams of pure energy that passed through shields as if they did not exist and struck directly at Krenth reactor cores. 5 Krenth battleships exploded simultaneously, and the remaining fleet faltered as fear replaced confidence. Lyria felt tears of pride because her people had overcome 300 years of intimidation to stand and fight. The Krenth commander realized then that this battle was lost because he faced enemies who would rather die than submit. He gave the order to retreat, but Miranda was not finished. She had Katie broadcast a message to every Krenth ship saying that any captain who surrendered would be treated with honor, and any who fled would be hunted. Over 300 Krenth ships surrendered on the spot, and their crews chose captivity over following a commander who had led them into disaster. The remaining Krenth fleet jumped to faster than light travel, and they scattered in different directions rather than face annihilation. When the battle ended, the Resolute was barely functional, and Miranda ordered evacuation to the surface. She was the last to leave her ship, and as she stepped into the shuttle, she looked back at the vessel that had brought humanity to this world. It would never fly again, but it had served its purpose and given birth to something new. On the surface, thousands of people gathered to greet the returning warriors. Both human and elven Lyria landed beside Miranda, and both were covered in soot and blood, and they embraced as sisters who had shared battle. The Elven Council elder approached and said that the ancient ships had been a gift from those who believed in the Alliance even when others doubted. He said that some elves had worked in secret for months to restore the vessels because they wanted to contribute more than just defense platforms. Miranda thanked him and said that this proved what both peoples could accomplish when they worked together. In the days that followed, the surrendered Krenth crews were processed, and most were simply soldiers who had been following orders. Miranda offered them a choice, and they could return to the Empire as prisoners for exchange, or they could stay on Thalvara and help build something better. Many chose to stay because they were tired of serving an empire that treated them as expendable. The battle became known across the galaxy as the Miracle at Thalvara, and other oppressed worlds began to wonder if they too could resist. Some sent messages asking for help, and others sent representatives to learn. About the alliance, Miranda and the Elven Council discussed whether to expand their reach, and ultimately decided that they would help any who asked, but would not impose themselves. Lyria proposed creating a training program where representatives from other worlds could learn both human tactics and elven traditions. Katie volunteered to lead this program, and within months, students from a dozen worlds arrived on Thalvara. Years passed, and the alliance grew stronger, and Thalvara became a symbol of what cooperation could achieve. Human settlements expanded, but always in consultation with elven environmental councils. Elven culture experienced a renaissance as the old ways merged with new possibilities. Silverwind and Nightflame had offspring, and young humans and elves learned together to bond with dragons. The Krenth Empire never returned because word had spread that attacking Thalvara meant facing enemies who fought with both honor and fury. Miranda eventually stepped down as military commander and focused on civilian leadership, and she helped establish laws that protected both peoples. Lyria became the ambassador to other worlds, and she traveled widely sharing the story of how two different peoples had found common ground. They remained close friends for the rest of their lives, and their partnership became legendary. On quiet evenings, they would sit together watching the sunset and talking about those early desperate days when everything hung by a thread. Miranda would say they had been lucky, but Lyria would correct her, saying it was not luck but choice. They had chosen to trust when distrust was easier, and to fight when surrender was tempting, and to build when destruction was simpler, and that choice had made all the difference, not just for them, but for everyone who came after.